hospital, I had opportunity to be with Bill Holmquist this morning. You probably, if you were at 8 o'clock worship, had opportunity to pray for Marilyn and Bill. Bill was taken to the hospital last evening. Marilyn and I spoke quite late into the night. Those of us that know the Holmquist well know that Bill, is 88 years young and has been, generally speaking, very healthy. But in the last weeks, he's been having difficulty specifically with breathing. They told him he had asthma. Bill's like, how do you get asthma at 88 years old? But nonetheless, his breathing difficulties have increased. He had a blood transfusion on Thursday. He and I talked on Thursday afternoon, and he said, don't worry, Pastor, I'll be better tomorrow. He actually started declining more. There will be more tests, and we'll have a better idea where things are at. One of our dear church family members who's in small group with Bill said, could I go and visit him today? And I said, not right now. And I would just encourage you to understand, how many of us have been in the hospital overnight? So you know what Bill, he hardly slept a wink last night, and it was right now, Marilyn is over there with them. Their daughter Ann is a doctor down in the Chicagoland area. She may be coming up later today. Bill is committed to getting out of the hospital so he can be at home because they have a bunch of family coming for Easter. And so Bill is only one of our family that are suffering. I was with Ruth Scheid yesterday. Ruth is begging that the Lord would take her home, and we had a great time of prayer and conversation. She told me about her confirmation day, and she told my hospital visiting partner, Mackenzie. And Mackenzie was there with me as we made that visit yesterday. And part of the reason for that is because Mackenzie's confirming her faith today, the promises of grace, and God has given her baptism. Thus, if you notice, Pastor Jeff is in daddy garb today. And so we're excited as the family gathers together and celebrates God's wonderful gifts and confirmation. Last week, bringing it back to where we're at, last week there was a real-life conversation that was talked about at the beginning of class, then again at the end of class. How many of you were here last week for discipleship hour? Most of us, but there are some of us that weren't, and it probably would be real helpful for us to spend a little more time. Some of you may have heard Pastor thought, well, we move on to confirmation. We've had quite a bit of feedback over the week. Questions. And this is a good thing. And it's really important for us as we talk about baptism and baptism within the church family, and specifically baptism within St. John's family. It's important for us to be comfortable asking questions and sharing our ideas and our thoughts. I want you to know that this is not an easy conversation, and quite frankly, it's not an easy conversation because of what we grew up with, or what we thought we grew up with, or how things were, or how things in our mind should be. And this is a challenging conversation. I'm going to bring you back to the scenario from last week. And I can't wear this. That's driving me nuts. So the scenario last week was a couple comes in and says, we'd like you to baptize our child. And they, in the conversation with the pastor, made it clear they don't have a church home. They don't intend to have a church home. They don't go to church. And as the conversation unfolds, we find out that actually their beliefs are that, Jesus is just one of many truths for life. What do we do? And before I open this up for you to ask a few questions, I want to make sure you hear very clearly as the senior pastor, as the shepherd of our congregation, never in this congregation do we look them in the face and say, we're not baptizing your child. What we say is, very clearly, we would love to be used by the Lord in the baptism of your child. And we're really excited to walk with you in discipleship. And we want to talk with you more about this. And we enter into a conversation, and that conversation, I can tell you, Pastor may have shared it last week, sometimes will go on literally for over a year. And those conversations go on as the family sets up appointments, and we continue in these talks about where does discipleship fit into, or where does baptism fit into God's call of making disciples. And so sometimes along the way, people will say things like, listen, are you going to baptize the child or not? When can we schedule the baptism? And at that point, we'll say, absolutely, we want to talk about, again, discipleship. And if at any time then they say, you know what, we're not going to continue in this conversation, we say, well, we can't require you to, but we sure would encourage you to stay. And if they remove themselves from it, then we're not the ones who are stopping this. They are. Now, this is very hard. These are conversations that take an enormous amount of emotion. I can tell you as pastor, and I don't know if Guy told you when he arrived 6 years ago, it was freaking him out. It was so tough. And it was a real challenge to help him to kind of experience this, just like Pastor Rob before him, and Pastor Cal, and Pastor Hayner. These conversations go on. They're prayed over. We spend time as pastors every Monday in conversation, working through, and so I wanted to again put this up here because some of you weren't here last week. Do you schedule a baptism? And so give us a chance, just if there are any questions that kind of come up just as far as we've gone so far. Because there are some that have been brought to me, and I'm going to bring those out for everyone. But are there any questions that you want to bring out so I can know what's going on inside of our minds? Any questions? Yes, Brian?
I guess, are there actual situations where parents come to you and say, we don't have a church home, we don't plan on it, we don't really believe in the church, but baptize the kid?
Yes, more often than you would think, actually. This has been a kind of an interesting phenomenon for me. Coming back here, I'll share a little bit about life in California, but one of the things coming back here, I have been kind of warned about this years and years ago, but in this culture, people have their children baptized for all kinds of reasons. Oftentimes it's because there's a grandma or a mother, or there is this community expectation, and they'll come with that in the background. But when I talk with them about, well, does your mom have a church home? Oftentimes not. So we'll have someone who's, now I can say this, I'm, at the age of oftentimes the grandparents of the little tyke, and the grandparent who is my age has disconnected from the church. But again, this is something you do. So yes, this happens more often than you would think. It's a good question. Other questions? Yes, back here.
What happens to the child?
What
happens to the if during this process, if it takes years, if the child dies?
That's a great question. What happens to the child? And what I would suggest to you is that is probably the most commonly asked question that I receive. And what I want to commend to you is that the child, this is how I talk with parents, the child always is in the hands of the Lord. Remember what Jesus says in John chapter 3? The Spirit of the Lord can go wherever the Spirit of the Lord wills. And so we recognize also Romans chapter 10. Remember Romans chapter 10? Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of the Lord. We actually know that God can create faith without baptism. Right? We know that. In fact, we who remember the story of Elizabeth and Mary, when Mary comes up to Elizabeth, she's pregnant, and Elizabeth says, "Oh my goodness, how great is it for I to be in the presence of the mother of my Lord?" And she says, "For my child inside of me leaped out of recognition of the baby whom you carry." Well, how in the world? John, is in the womb of Elizabeth. God is at work. And what I'm going to show you is actually this concern for the children is actually what is driving and has driven this conversation all the way back to the early church. And we're going to look at that today. It's a great question. Other questions? Yes, June. Yes. 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 Yeah. Oh, hold on 1 second. I think people can hear this really is good. So June said she has grandchildren that live in Colorado, but the grandchildren live there, and there are 2 great-grandchildren.
Yes, and Mom doesn't want to get them baptized right now. And as a great-grandma, what do I do?
We're going to talk about that. That is so important. And what I would suggest to you is we do what we've always done. We pray. We model life of discipleship. And recognize, and I will tell you this, I'm going to say it now and reiterate it, that actually grandmas, hear this well. It would be more important to talk about discipleship than baptism. To talk about what it means to repent. That's what Jesus used. That's what John the Baptist used. To return to the Lord. I can't tell you how many young 20-somethings come to me and they are freaked out because they don't understand baptism. You do. You see it in the way that you were raised as one step in a life of discipleship, but they don't, and so they think that you want it for some superstition. They tell us that they actually think you think it's some sort of fire insurance policy because you might inadvertently slip and say, well, what if the child dies? He's going to go to hell. That's not the thing to say to a 20-year-old who's had a 25-year-old with a little baby. We talk about discipleship. We talk about what it means to raise our children in the Lord. So it's a great, and we hurt. I was so pleased. I think Pastor Guy gave us permission to hurt. You understand? You have permission to grieve. The Palm Sunday account I just read to Bill has Jesus, it's from Luke, Jesus at the hill descending into Jerusalem is grieving. He is weeping. The Apostle Paul, Romans chapter 9, Paul is weeping. He is grieving. Oh, that I would be cursed. I would rather give up my salvation, my place in the family, for that little child. And it's okay to weep and grieve and pray and beg. And then we wait. Because always this is in the Lord's hands. Good questions. Anything else? Yes.
Spiritually, the
Dave.
Spirit was almost around us and moving us even back then in the days of the Old Testament. But when Jesus came on the scene, baptism was actually used.
That's a great question. When was baptism? Baptism actually predates Jesus. The Jews used baptism. Baptism was used as a way of initiation. The word baptize means to wash. It was actually used ceremonially for washing things that became unclean. Like if a Gentile sat in your chair in your house, a soldier walked in, baptizo, you would baptize the chair. You would baptize those Gentiles that came into the faith. However, that was a different baptism in the sense that looked ahead, because the Spirit did not, remember we've talked about this before, the Spirit was given at Pentecost. So the Spirit at work before that was certain times among certain places to accomplish certain tasks. But at Pentecost, all of God's people have been given the Spirit. It's a great observation. Don't want to get too theological, so in case we're thinking, my goodness, we want to get into this a little further. Here's what happened to me last week, and I didn't have a chance. I actually talked to a couple of the fellas, so you consider yourself off the hook, guys, because I couldn't get there because I was with Mr. Holmquist. But the guys who came to me said, Pastor, what's happening is the parents you are holding the children hostage because of their parents. How many of us have felt that way? I mean, come on, I have. We've all wrestled with this. And so I said, well, what do you mean? Well, really, it shouldn't matter who they are. If parents bring the child forward, then baptize the child. It really doesn't matter. And it happened to be two fellas, and so that kind of inspired what you're going to see on the screen. One of the fellas is here, Mike Bryan, but I chose not to embarrass you, Mike. Just want to. Okay, so Art and Dan. This is a real-life conversation. This has happened. I'm going to tell you more about it. But Art and Dan come for the baptism of their child. While you're visiting with them, you find out they're not members, don't currently attend a church, don't plan on joining a church, don't really know what baptism is, and believe that Jesus is one of the many truths. You baptize the child at St. John's 8 o'clock service. Art and Dan are both guys. Yeah, it could have been Susie and Sally. Absolutely. This has happened. So, you baptize the child. Talk about it in your groups. I'll be back with you in a moment. Spend some time. Stay in your groups, if you would, and draw your eyes up here. This is actually a real-life occurrence. I can speak to this one. You might say, well, this must be just like completely unlikely to happen, but I do believe, and I thought I heard Cheryl Whipperforth say that, were you at a church that this... But it wasn't two men, it was two gals. So this is in Wisconsin, but I can speak from my experience in California. And what I can tell you is this really leads us to some very, very difficult realizations. And I'll just tell it to you like the fellas yesterday, it wasn't Mike, it was the other gentleman, said, well, of course you wouldn't. And then I said, oh, really? Well, you just told me that it doesn't matter, you should baptize the child no matter what, the parents. And then he realized he's stuck. And what I would tell you is it's because, quite frankly, we haven't dealt with this. It's the elephant in the room. You say, Pastor, what's the elephant in the room? Well, the elephant in the room is that baptism was never intended to be separated from discipleship. And that actually sin is sin. And that the only thing that we can hold on to is the first act of the Spirit at work in the lives of people is repentance. And so it wouldn't matter to me whether someone was not coming to church, which is sin. And if you don't believe it's sin, which, by the way, I'm teaching a religion class over at Concordia, in the textbook it mocks Protestants. It says, the ministers believe that going to church is required to be a Christian, and it's part of the Christian life, but research shows that most Protestants do not believe it. No, that's right in my textbook. I'll show it to you. But I'll be up front with you. We've spent some time. Let's go through Luther's catechism. Let's go through the liturgy. Let's go through the Bible. And what I would tell you is we've disconnected baptism from discipleship. And we've thought that Jesus actually called us to go and baptize. Jesus said, go make disciples. And we're going to do a little history lesson today. Because I think that when we start to realize how did we get here in this country, and I would welcome you to ask questions, but let me take you through a little bit, which you might find helpful in this, and that is, could we read this out loud? The task of the church at the present moment is to recover the integrity of baptism. The task of believers is to use their baptism. We're going to be spending, we've started spending time on what it means to use your baptism, to live in it. Luther says each day, remember your baptism. We begin every service here, returning again to the waters of our baptism, remembering our baptism. That was one of the very few changes I brought when I came here, because I wanted to heighten the significance of baptism within the life of every day. But notice he says the integrity. This is the task of the church. This is we, the church, together. And so you might say, well, how did we get here? And he suggests, which is this Lutheran theologian, that this is how we got here. Would you read this out loud? Now, if you're wondering what in the world is the ancient rite, we're going to talk about that. But let me help you know that we only have what we have. We have the New Testament scriptures, which give us examples of baptism. If we were a room full of Baptists, if we were a room full of Pentecostals, they would come with the statement, well, where is there an infant baptized in the New Testament? If you've got family members who are friends, that they would tell you there's no example of that, and that's not accurate. We know that actually, when Jesus gave the command in Matthew chapter 28, go make disciples of all nations, baptizing and teaching them, children would have been a part of the all nations. We know that because in Acts, we already see evidences of households being baptized. And we have examples within the biblical corpus itself of children and infants being baptized. But let's be clear. We don't have a strong sense of exactly what was going on until about 275 to 300 AD. And that's when this is very clearly documented. It's the ancient rite. And by then the church has 5 different places, if you will, on different continents. There's Alexandria in Africa, there's Constantinople, there's Rome. These heads of the church, these places. And in these places there is consistency on one thing, and that is this ancient rite. There's not consistency on whether infants were baptized. Some places chose to wait. By the way, Augustine's mother Some of us know Augustine. Augustine's mother, she waited, as did his grandmother, and did exactly what you're doing, June. Prayed and begged. Augustine was raised in a Christian home. He actually begged to be baptized, ironically, as a child, and because he was going to die, he thought, and she put it off. He went far and wide, became a real monstrous pagan, and then actually God's Spirit brought him back. Augustine, if you know, just type in Augustine in your Google, one of the most profound defenders of the Christian faith. But before Augustine, we know about this ancient rite. And the first act was the separation from the old life. Could we read that out loud? For months.
4 years, unless there was an emergency, converts were submitted to the discipline of the academy.
Yeah, you're like, what in the world is that? It's a school. Actually, the catechumenate was a school, and by the way, it was a very, very intense training. I could take time and read to you, but my wife said, please, I read this to her, and she said, please don't read that. Way too much theological jargon. Just put it in everyday language. Here's what it's, but I wanted you to hear this. High level of supervision and accountability. Training in knowledge and behavior. It included work with learning how to pray, learning how to serve in the community. It was literally separating oneself from the old life. So this was the first act. It would go on, and no baptism would take place of anyone in these families during this period. However, the period would come to a close. Some of us know the origin of this. What season of the church year is still celebrated today as the church's way to walk with these catechumenates? What? Lent. Lent's 40 days. The origin of Lent was that you have been training and working hard. We're going to walk alongside of you and give up during this time period as you prepare for your baptism. Does that give you a new idea? I mean, we were out with some Roman Catholics recently, and everyone was eating meat, and she was like, I don't eat meat today. And they were teasing her. I said, well, you chose that, right? She said, willingly. Can you imagine willingly giving up so that we could walk alongside of? And then on Easter Eve, generally speaking, again, we run into a new word here. So I had to go Google Translate for this baby too. Epiclesis. Let's read it out loud. Again, some of us know this section. We have a little bit of it in our liturgy, but not much. How many of us remember the part in the liturgy where we say, do you renounce the devil? Do you renounce all his works? Do you renounce all his ways? Remember this? That was just the last little bit of what was a much more significant period right before the baptism, where there were multiple exorcisms. Exorcisms? You bet. In fact, Luther himself said there should not be a baptism without an exorcism. Because even as the Spirit of God hovered over the waters in creation, at this point, that which is dead is going to be brought to life. Which comes back to, why do people come to us for a baptism? Pastor Guy, God bless him, man, he is just great. So you brought your kid to be killed, huh? Now just imagine a little 25-year-old who comes in, he's a lot more tactful. I'm probably even more blunt. How many 20-somethings bring their child in to be killed? Well, no, we dress them up in white so that way they could be blessed. We want the family to know how special this little girl is. That's hogwash. That is completely pagan. You bring the child, you bring the adult to be killed. And this was all part of the second act. In fact, the second act included the baptism itself, where the person was stripped naked, just like Jesus was stripped naked when he was put on the cross. I know that might offend our little decencies, but this is what the Son of God was willing to do. And in baptism, we are connected to Christ. We are stripped of anything that would be pretense. That's why, by the way, baptistries were never in the... Can you imagine in front of the church? Okay, rip it off, baby. But no, baptistries were outside of the church proper. And the people would be in worship, waiting. And in this baptistry, this would go on. This is where deaconesses came in, incidentally. You have a woman, you're not going to have a priest. The woman would be stripped naked. She would go down in the water. And yes, Luther himself, though he said it was not required, because there were a lot of places in the early church there was not enough water. But Luther himself said immersion was the best, because of the symbolism of dying and rising. And so there would be these things that would go on tied to the baptism. And they would go under, they would come up, and then they would have oils put all over their bodies. Why would they have oils put on their bodies? Oil was used for what? Anointing a king or a queen. You are a prince or a princess in the family of God. And they would be given new garments. Why? The robe of righteousness. It was the fulfillment of Jesus' parable, and they would be dressed all up, and they would be walked into the gathering. The service would stop, and it was at this time that the third act would take place. Would you read, again, all these big old words, neophyte. How would you like to say that one, Monica, you neophyte? Sounds like something I'd tell my baby sister, you're neophyte. All right, the neophyte is a beginner, so let's read it out loud. The neophyte emerged, washed in oil, and clothed in garments. They were then led to where the congregation was holding vigil. The service would stop, and in the service they would have a celebration. And what kind of things would be at the celebration? Depending on the context, but there were oftentimes, more frequent than anything, there was milk and honey. Why milk and honey? Anybody remember your Old Testament? Huh? Promised land. You have come into you are one of the promised people. They would have milk and honey, and actually they would celebrate communion, the Lord's Supper, because this was never done. Communion was never celebrated with non-believers in the room. They would be dismissed. All during your catechumenate, you would be preparing, and then you would have this. So you can start to